Your righteousness must exceed that of the most religious, or you will not see God. Get your coffee. What do you depend upon for your standing before God? That really is a good question. Perhaps you've seen the evangelistic method where you ask someone, if you died tonight, do you think that you would go to heaven? I've certainly had conversations with people using that methodology before. You can argue the merits of such an approach. That's certainly not my focus here. I bring it up because I've always found that the responses are rather fascinating when you ask people that question. Most people assume their own goodness. That's not necessarily a bad thing. I'm fairly certain that I do the same thing. We assume our own goodness because, for the most part, we're pretty good. And when we look at other people, well, we can always find someone or imagine a person who is much worse than ourselves. So, comparatively speaking, I'm a fairly good person. So when asked, if you died tonight, do you think you would go to heaven? Most people say, yes. To which we would follow up with the question, why? On the basis of what? There's another way that maybe you can ask this question as well. If you died tonight and you stood before God and he asked you, why should I let you into heaven? What would you say? Again, there are some fascinating responses, and people are kind of expected to say, well, yeah, I think I would go to heaven because I'm a pretty good person, or God would let me into heaven because I've been pretty good. Clearly, that answer reveals that such a person is depending upon their own efforts at goodness to be sufficient on the day of judgment. So that brings me back to my initial question. What do you depend upon for your standing before God? Virtually everyone I've ever interacted with using this question has revealed in their answer that they are trusting in or depending upon their own efforts, their own good works, according to their own standard of goodness, generally based upon evaluating themselves in light of others. And since we can always find someone worse than us, we're always able to say, I'm a pretty good person. I'm not perfect, but I'm pretty good. Prior to his conversion, this was the Apostle Paul's way as well. His confidence was in his lineage and in his good works. He came from the right family and he lived in the right way for him to assume that he would be in the right standing before God on the day of judgment. Paul lays this out clearly in the opening paragraph of Philippians chapter 3. Effectively, Paul says, I have more reason to trust in and depend upon my own good standing and good works to get me into heaven than just about anyone, because, he says in verses 5 through 6, I was circumcised the 8th day of the stock of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of the Hebrews, concerning the law, a Pharisee, concerning zeal, persecuting the church, concerning righteousness, which is in the law, I was blameless. So for the non-Jew or the not so religiously committed Jew, very little of what Paul says there in that passage will mean anything to you. But basically, Paul says, before my conversion, I was from the right family, and it was a faithfully committed family, and I was a part of the right group and did everything the right way with a greater passion and zeal than most people, and I was pretty much right on and righteous. So if ever there was someone that should get into heaven on their own best efforts and upbringing, Paul says, that's me. Aside from the brute arrogance of such words, from a purely earthly standpoint, Paul's logic seems pretty solid, except that entrance into heaven isn't based upon earthly logic or reasoning. In fact, from the heavenly perspective, these things are, well, Paul calls them useless garbage. That's the same sentiment presented by the prophet Isaiah when he wrote in Isaiah 64, verse 6, that we are all like an unclean thing, and all of our righteousness is like filthy rags. Obviously, this isn't the way that we want to view ourselves, but this is the proper assessment of our goodness. That is, when it is measured against the perfect holiness of a holy, holy, holy God. Yes, when your goodness is measured against the failures of others, you shine pretty brightly, but that isn't the standard we're measured against. we're not even measured against the goodness of other super religious people. Jesus said, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, the most righteous and religious people of his day, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. And God says, be holy, for I am holy. So obviously, we have a bit of a problem. We will never measure up to God's perfect righteous standard. And in reality, that is the point. The whole point of a standard so great that you could never measure up to it is to reveal that you will never measure up, and you are in desperate need of a righteousness which is from God by faith. As the prophet Habakkuk declared, the just shall live by faith. Something to think about. We'll see you next time.